Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, March 23rd, and it's day whatever of our self-isolation, social distancing experiment here at the Taylor House here in Stratford. It's a Monday. It's a beautiful day outside. Janice and I went for a walk around the community, out probably over an hour. We did about 5.6 kilometers, which is over 3 miles. Our chief medical officer gave another briefing today, as she does every afternoon during the week. And luckily, we're still at 3 cases. We bumped up to 3 yesterday, and we're holding at 3. But more measures are starting to be implemented around the country to try to help control this. And PEI is no exception. Over the weekend, as you would have seen from a previous vlog, we here in PEI decided to meet travelers at the airport and at our entry points. We have a bridge entry point from New Brunswick. We also have a ferry that runs all year round from the Magdalen Islands in Quebec to Surrey, PEI, and they've been included as well in our border control, if you want to call it that. The border isn't closed and we're not stopping people, but we are educating. We as a government, we as a province, are educating travelers who arrive on PEI that they need to self-isolate for 14 days minimum, whether they were outside the country or coming from some other part of Canada. Nova Scotia is doing the same thing now at the New Brunswick border. New Brunswick is not quite doing that yet on their side of the border, but there were some questions put to the Premier of New Brunswick this afternoon that he may be prompted from those questions and from other research that's going on, be willing to set up some kind of similar border presence at the Campbellton Pointe de la Croix bridge to Quebec, as well as the 185 Trans-Canada border in Edmundston, New Brunswick, and a few other places. Also, of course, the other part of New Brunswick borders the United States, and there's already a lot of slowdown at that border, of course, for all kinds of good reasons. One of the peculiar things that this brings up, and I talked about Campbellton and St. Stephen the other day being very close communities. There's a bit of a real weird thing going on with a place called Campobello Island. Campobello is owned by and is part of the province of New Brunswick, but it shares a bridge with Lubec, Maine. And the only way the people of Campobello Island can get off the island in the wintertime when the ferries aren't running is to drive over to Lubec, Maine, go through American customs, and then drive through Maine to get back to the Canadian side of the border up in Calais, St. Stephen. So right now, with the border essentially closed to non-essential travel, it's a little tricky for the people of Campobello to get their groceries and just do basic things. Anyway, the government of New Brunswick has made arrangements with the federal government, and I think the state of Maine and the federal government in the U.S. to permit New Brunswickers from Campobello to cross the border and stay in their vehicles and not get out as long as they drive straight to the other border at Calais, St. Stephen, and get out on the St. Stephen side after that and do their banking and groceries or whatever they need to do, and then come back the same way. So essentially they're almost bonded, like a bonded carrier in between, where they've given an undertaking not to get out of their vehicles. There's still some questions, though, from the Charlotte County media. What if someone in Campobello just wants a quart of milk? Right now, under that provision, they couldn't stop at a convenience store over in Lubec and get that quart of milk. They'd have to drive all the way half an hour or more than half an hour, to St. Stephen just to get a quart of milk rather than just buy it in Maine. So they're trying to ease the border restriction at that particular entry point just for that reason. So these are some of the things that you run into when you share a border with a friend. Canada and the US are friends, and not everything is exactly the same on both sides when it comes to how we handle our laws, how we handle things like civil rights and everything else, but we're still very good friends, and we have very similar democratic and justice systems. And we want to make sure they're as compatible and they fit together as nicely as possible. So tonight, I think it's tonight around 6:30 or so Eastern Time, the premiers of all provinces and the premiers of the 3 territories and the Prime Minister will be having a conference call. And it will probably be a very important conference call. One thing that Canada has not yet done as a nation is invoke the Emergency Measures Act federally, nationwide. Each individual province and municipality have occasionally gone in and invoked their own local emergency measures legislation, declaring states of emergency, which give the local authorities certain powers. But there is a federal power that can be invoked in times of extreme crisis. And we're almost to the point, I think, where that's about to be triggered now. The provinces have slightly different approaches across the country as to how to do this. Similar in the states, it's a federal system like we have. There's 50 different states, and each state has its own independence in a way to do things its way. And that is the reason that the President of the United States has been reluctant to invoke some of the more sweeping powers that the federal government has in the United States. It does impact on states' rights a little bit. It seems, though, up here in Canada that the provinces are maybe eager for the Prime Minister and the federal government to bring in and invoke or declare active the Emergency Measures Act in Canada. That will allow the federal government to impose penalties for people who refuse to social distance and self-isolate, even after being told to. There have been several instances in around Halifax and Vancouver and other places where on a nice sunny day on the weekend, people were gathering at the beach. They were playing ball. They were hanging out, having picnics, and they were not supposed to be doing these things if they followed the strong request and urging to stop doing it, but they weren't stopping. So we're going to ask you nice, and then we're going to remind you one time, but pretty soon we're going to have to call mom and dad and bring the law down. So I think that's just about where we are now to get people to smarten up. I just rubbed my nose there, and I did touch my face, but I just sanitized completely from head to toe. So just in case you saw that, you got me. Anyway, so that phone call is going to happen today. Probably there might be an announcement, maybe not tonight, but certainly over the course of tomorrow, an announcement will probably happen that Canada is undergoing even tighter restrictions at all of our provincial boundaries, and people are going to have to stay home more aggressively than before. We'll still be allowed to go out and get groceries and pharmaceuticals and other necessities of life, and some businesses will still be going, such as those that deliver oil and provide electricity and those kinds of things that we need to have. But for the most part, we're stuck. We're stuck for quite some time. So I hope it's going okay wherever you are. I wondered what topic I might talk about today other than what I just did, the situation we're all dealing with. Neil suggested I talk a little bit about my ancient history as a member of a pit crew on a stock racing team and some of my NASCAR experiences as well. NASCAR has been brought home to me fairly closely this weekend because yesterday, if my trip to Florida had gone as planned, I would have been at Homestead Miami Speedway watching the NASCAR race, the Cup race. We had plans to go. We had seats not purchased, but they were identified. We knew where we wanted to sit. We had permission from our wives to go, so it was all perfectly lined up. And then this happened, so we didn't go at all. So that would have been the first NASCAR race I'd been to in a couple of decades, actually. I've been to Daytona Speedway and watched the Busch Grand National race, as it then was, on the Saturday of Speed Weeks. And that was a great race. It was won by Dale Earnhardt, so that tells you how long ago that was. I think that was around 1993 or 1994. That's back when Dale Earnhardt could win every race at Daytona except the big one. He could win the Twin 125s, he could win the Clash, he could win the Busch race, but he couldn't seem to win the actual Daytona 500. He eventually did, but of course, tragically, not long after that, he was killed at that speedway. But it was to be my first visit to a NASCAR track in quite some time this past weekend, yesterday, as a matter of fact, and it didn't happen, and I don't know when it might get a chance to happen again in the future. And back in the, I guess, mid-1990s, I helped out with a local stock car driver who had a car in the Pro Stock circuit in New Brunswick. His name was Tommy. He ran the number 93 car, and he was based in my hometown of Doketown. And along with my brother-in-law Terry and several other people, we would go with Tommy to races, typically on Saturday nights, sometimes on Sunday afternoons, Saturday afternoons, over to the Gary Speedway near Fredericton. But we also went to Caribou, Maine, to the races there. We went to Antigonish, Nova Scotia. We traveled around the Maritimes with the car. I was involved for a year or two. I was a very minor player here. I helped with their radio communications. I did some spotting from the fence line with a walkie-talkie, and I tried to get the headset working, some earbuds working inside Tommy's helmet so that he could hear me calling out accidents or yellow flags or anything like that. I took down the tire temperatures. I guess I tried to be somewhat helpful and just stay out of the way. Didn't do any engine tuning or anything like that. Threw some tires in the back of the truck once in a while, and just had a lot of fun, just like being around the car. I like being around the race environment. I like racing a lot. I still do. Lately, I've become more of a fan of Formula One than I have with stock cars. I find that the Nextel or the Energy, whatever it is, Monster Energy Cup, these days is just nowhere near as cool as it used to be back when it was the Winston Cup. The cars are more identical now. There's the same amount of drama. The drivers that want to go at each other after the race is over. And there's still drivers you like and drivers you don't like. I'm not a fan of Kyle Busch, and I'm not a fan of Joey Logano and some other drivers, but I really like Martin Truex, and I really like Chase Elliott, and I like Ryan Newman. I hope he's back soon. But it's just not the same. I come from an older school of NASCAR fan. I like Buddy Baker and Harry Gant and Cale Yarborough and Benny Parsons and Phil Parsons even. A lot of people don't remember Phil, but I remember Phil. And the ball trips. Darrell especially. Wasn't a big fan of Michael, but I really liked Darrell. And my favorite driver, period, was Richard Petty. And he's still around the racetrack as an owner. He's still involved with the 43 car that Bubba Wallace drives. Every time there's a race, I cheer for Bubba. And I usually get disappointed. Bubba, the last few years, has been finishing in the between 20th and 30th. Almost every race he runs in, he's usually a couple of laps down. And the magic seems to be gone from the 43, which is a shame. But I remember Richard Petty back when he was virtually invincible. The guy won 200 races. He was a 7-time champion at a time when, if you go back into the late 50s, early 60s when he started racing, sometimes there were 50 and 60 cars on the track. Sometimes there were 50 or 60 races every year. They raced everywhere. They raced on beaches. They raced in dirt tracks and asphalt tracks and good old boys, and probably lots of cheating going on too, which is the way it would work back then. So I really, really like the old style stock car racing. Now it's all too pretty, too media savvy, too glitzy. I want people covered in oil, and I want lots of smoke and lots of dirt and lots of chewing tobacco and all that. But those days are gone. So anyway, I still enjoy watching Formula One for the most part. And if there's a Daytona race or a Talladega race, I'm definitely watching. When they race in Loudon, I usually watch just because I consider it my home track from here. I like watching the Brickyard 400. I'm not a fan of those 1.5 mile Bruton Smith cookie cutter Charlotte type speedways that are all over the place now, all over the U.S. There's and they're not sufficiently different for me to distinguish them. Texas and Fontana and Kansas and Las Vegas and Chicago, and they're all just kind of the same track for me. I like back in the old days when they raced at Rockingham and they raced at Darlington and they raced at North Wilkesboro. Those tracks had real character. They weren't all perfect. They were bumpy and there was guardrails and just the good old days of racing are gone, and they'll probably never come back, which is a shame. But because I like that kind of racing, I still will go to the local track here at Oyster Bed Bridge and watch the local cars go a couple of times a year. I usually go with a buddy of mine, or I went with Neil once. We just sit there and just watch the cars go around, eat some greasy fries, have some onion rings, smell the gas and the oil burning, and it's just a fantastic Saturday night. Anyhow, I hope those days will be back soon, and we can go to our racetracks and go to our sporting events all around America and all around Canada here in a couple of months' time. When the summer gets back into high gear, we'll all be able to enjoy it. That's my hope. Take care of yourselves. Don't touch your face, and be careful out there, and be more careful in there, and sanitize all around you. Don't become part of the problem. Always try to be part of the solution. See you later.